special treat and privilege to be able to reconnect with my esteemed former roommate here, Ben, and get a chance to learn with him and with you all. So it's lovely to see you. I recognize a couple of names here, I think, but I think most of you are new friends. So it's a great opportunity to be with you. We have about an hour now, and I want to explore with you all the question of, does a Jew own anything? Does a Jew own anything? And Ben just put in the chat, if you can access that, a source sheet, which we'll be referencing, and I probably will screen share as well as we go. But if you're able to open that on the side, that way we can still talk and see the gallery view, and you can also be looking at the source sheet. Thank you, Ben. So even before, however, we start accessing that, we are a small enough group, which is great that I can get a chance to know each other just very briefly, personally on this front. So let me just these people whose videos I see, if you don't mind, my asking you just to introduce yourself and there go some videos, and share kind of what brought you here today, just in a sentence. What about the topic drew you today, and introduce yourself. So if you don't mind, I'm sorry putting the spot, but Larry and then Aaron, if you don't mind just saying hi and where you're zooming in from and what you're looking to explore today. Larry?
Oh, yeah, I'm sitting in Royal Oak, Michigan right now.
Okay.
My name is Larry Booker, and I'm going to kind of guess that this has to do with the Shemitah year. So that's what I'm interested in.
Terrific. Okay, so connections possibly to Shemitah. We will reference Shemitah. It's not about Shemitah, but we definitely will reference Shemitah. So thank you for knowing that. For those who don't know, Shemitah is the sabbatical year. We happen to be in a sabbatical year right now, which involves sort of restrictions on land use in the land of Israel, as well as financial ramifications as well, both within and without the land of Israel. So thank you for that, Aaron.
Yeah, I'm Aaron from White Plains, New York, and I think a lot about what the new ideas of like digital ownership and digital property, and so the title intrigued me, and I'm always interested to learn from, learn something new.
From people. Terrific. Okay, so digital property, intellectual property more broadly. What does it even mean to own ideas, for example, but digital property as well, non-physical tangible objects? Terrific. Is it Deborah?
Hi, I'm in southeastern Massachusetts. I don't know, it sounded like a provocative topic, so I just thought I would zoom in. And I'm going to turn off my video because my audio is scratchy. So
that is fine. Nice to get a chance to see your face for a bit there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Phyllis Levy.
Hi, I'm Phyllis Levy from Miami, Florida. As a Reformed Jew, I feel that we express our Judaism through social action. And I was just adding up our charitable donations for my husband working on the taxes. And, the question about how much do we share with there's so much need in the world, and what do we owe as Jews to give to fill those needs. So that's a question that I'm always thinking about and trying to act on.
Okay, that's a terrific context. Thank you. And our topic today relates certainly to taxes and tax season, although that'll be sort of an ancillary reference, but certainly it touches on that topic, as well as the topic of charity and tithing and such things. I'll just share that some have the practice. There is a mitzvah of giving charity out of 10% of one's earnings, tithing literally, and how that's calculated, and whether that's actually mandatory according to Jewish law or merely a sort of recommended practice is debated. But there are those, I just will share, there are those people who have the practice of having a separate bank account into which 10% of their paycheck goes directly, and that bank account is then is sort of earmarked and demarcated for charitable donations, and that's a very different type of feeling, right, than having it all in your bank account to begin with, and then use it and then taking 10% out of that bank account, as if to say like it's already there, it's already separate, which is both a good thing in terms of motivation, helps you, motivate yourself to use it, and also, indicates a consciousness of which that 10% actually was always separate from the rest of your monies, or the rest of your possessions. That's something that maybe we'll come back to that, but it's not something to think about. I see a lot more people have joined, so for time's sake, I can't get through everybody now, although I'd love to keep doing this, but maybe one more who was here earlier was Becca. If you don't mind sharing a little bit. I see you raised your hand, about where you're from, what brought you here, and then we'll start the learning together.
Hi, yeah, I love this question. The title is very provocative, as somebody else said, and I've spent many years thinking about the concept of ownership. I'm from San Francisco, and there was a politician that I went to a dinner with once, like probably 4 or 5 years ago, Jane Kim, and she said something that I'd never even thought of before, which is that property ownership is invented, and like really maybe we shouldn't have it at all. And as a renter who is seeking to buy a home someday, I find that very complicated, especially with with being in a colonialist state, where we own land that we stole at some point in time. So that's why I'm here.
Interesting. Okay, great. Thank you. It's funny, I didn't mean to be provocative per se in my title, but it's good that I provoke people to come with us. So I appreciate that. And I see, Deborah, your comment about the Donor Advised Fund in the chat. If I miss comments in the chat as we're going, please feel free just to raise your hand or jump in as feels appropriate. But I might miss it. Look, let's learn together a little bit about the question of, does a Jew own anything? Given why everyone is here and what we're looking to explore. First of all, what is ownership? What is ownership? So I'm going to ask everybody now who can access the chat to simultaneously just think for a moment and then write in a few ideas. It doesn't have to be a fully formed thesis, but try to explain what is ownership. And then we'll get to the question of, does a Jew actually own? What is ownership? So just start thinking and typing. Don't worry, we won't be held to anything, but just let's get ourselves into a conversation here. What does it mean to own something? What is ownership? Ruth says the right to solely control a resource. Becca, legalized possession of property. Okay, so we're all talking about rights, the solely part, right? So that's private property. Control, right? Legal. Possession, Phil, is something in your possession for the moment. Okay, so it could be temporary, but for now it's in your possession. And as more comments are coming in, I'll note that, in Anglo-American law, we talk, I don't know if anyone here is a lawyer, we talk about ownership as a bundle of sticks. As a bundle, and what that means is that there's multiple pieces of ownership. I can go to secure the use of the resources, says Leah, Todd, the right to stop others from taking the use of the resource, right? It's interesting. So it's my own relationship to the object, and the lack of other people's relationship, right, to that object. So in Anglo-American law, this idea of bundle of sticks, which means that ownership is kind of a potpourri, if you will, right? It's a challenge, since this is Limmud, of various rights, relationships, relationship to the object, relationship to others, rights, privileges, and responsibilities. And it's a mix of those things. So when we talk about someone owning something, we're talking about a variety of pieces. In halakha, or in classic sort of rabbinic thinking, we talk about ownership as well as being a mix of things, a bundle of sticks, if you will. A common distinction within the notion of ownership is the distinction between mamon and reshut, meaning monetary possession on the one hand. Do I own it legally? Did I purchase it through viable legal means? And reshut in the sense of control, right? Do I have control of said object, for example? Let's say my thermos, let's say the land that I'm standing under, on top of, do I have control? Can I do with it that which I want, etc. Right? And there are times you might have one and not the other. So for example, if, this is a classic case in the Talmud, if A steals an animal from B. So B may own it in terms of mammon, they may have monetary possession of an animal, but because the other person stole it, they don't have control over it. And the reverse, of course, someone who has control over it, the thief, doesn't have a monetary claim to that object. So they've divided the ownership. And the consequence of that, and we'll get to this at the end of our time together here, the consequence of that is, one consequence is that neither of them have full ownership of the animal, and neither can dedicate it as a sacrifice. Because in order to dedicate an object as an animal as a sacrifice to the temple, it has to be yours. And in order to be yours, you have to both own it and have control over it. Right, have control of it. So neither the owner nor the thief can be makdish, can dedicate it to the temple. And that's something we'll come back to in about, I'd say, 40 minutes or so, give or take. Okay, so does a Jew own anything? Here's my second question. My second question for you all. I see Aaron writes, agency, control, or something recognized by others. Yeah, absolutely. Or Todd, in America, you can shoot someone who's trying to take your property. So that's right. So that just expresses some of the rights that you have vis-a-vis your land and the ramification of it vis-a-vis others. Okay, good. Now, we've talked a little bit about ownership. Okay, and by the way, I should say that, as you may know, and this is not our topic, but there is a whole field like the philosophy of ownership, right? In Western philosophy, certainly, right? What does it mean to own? Why do we own? Is it a natural right? Is it a constructed arrangement, right? Is it even a philosophical thing? Some philosophers say this isn't our topic. It's not philosophical. It's just a convention designed to like control resources vis-a-vis other people. But there's no sort of philosophy about it to speak of. Some speak of ownership as an extension of self-ownership, right? An extension of myself. If I make something and I own myself, it somehow is imbued with my selfhood, right? It's hard to. The point is that the question is powerful. It's like you actually think about, well, what is ownership and why should I own something? What does it mean to own something? It's not such a simple thing to work out. But we have some sort of working, not definition, but some terms and some notions here that we can start proceeding with our conversation. So, does a Jew own anything? Does a Jew own anything? So let's do the chat thing again. Your instincts. Does a Jew own anything? Yes, no, sort of, sources. Let's get out there in the chat, what you're thinking, what you're bringing to this conversation. Right, so Todd references this idea of renting from God and responsibility to treat it well. There is this notion that like we're in this world and there's a Baal Habayit, right? The owner sort of, and we are the workers in this world. So maybe you're referring to that. Does God ultimately own anything, everything? We own it temporarily, says Ben. So it sounds like we do own it for a limited amount of time, right? It's kind of like maybe it's sort of like a rental or a short-term lease or ownership. Yes, says Leah, we do own. Yes, we own things. After all, Jacob had to go back and pick up his jars that he left. That's right. He didn't ignore them, as the sages note, right? Enough to sustain themselves and their family. If we don't own, then sacrifice doesn't make sense, says Larry, because Larry's assuming that in order to sacrifice, you have to have owned it. If you didn't own it, what's the point of sacrificing it? What's the meaning of the sacrifice? Okay, we're going to come back to that later as well. Yes, we own things. Lulav and etrog, says Aaron. Right, and Aaron's point, I think, in part is that not only, can you own a lulav and etrog, but in order to fulfill, according to the third chapter, Chapter Sukkah at least, right, in order to fulfill the commandment of shaking the lulav and etrog, the four species on Sukkot, you have to own them. It has to be lachem, mishalachem. You have to own that object. So apparently, right, the general sense that I got from people here is that there's simply some sense in which we own things in the world, right? Right, a Jew owns things. A human being Jew owns things in the world. Actually, must own things, because otherwise, how could they be enjoined to sacrifice? How can they be enjoined to shake the four species which presume ownership? And but more broadly, there's a sort of sense that halacha and Jewish tradition, more broadly, is full of sort of takes for granted that we own things. Look at the entire tractate Nizikin, or the order of Nizikin of damages in the Talmud, six of the Talmud. It's full of stuff about presuming that someone can own something. If someone doesn't own something, what does it mean to damage their property? What does it mean to steal from them if they didn't own it to begin with? or sacrifices, the whole order of sacrifices, which assume that you own it. If you don't own it, what's the point of sacrificing it? So it sounds like you own it. So on the one hand, and you can reference here, you could think about this as sort of a tension in the Psalms. In Psalm 115, we talk about the heavens belonging to God. Hashamayim Shamayim Adonai, v'ha'aretz natan livnei adam. But the earth was given over to people. The earth belongs to people, to humankind. That's Psalm 115. And then you read, on the other hand, Psalm 24. And Psalm 24 says, Ladonai ha'aretz umulu'ah tevel v'yosheva. To God is the earth and its fullness. In fact, tevel v'chol yosheva, not only the earth and the world itself, but all those who dwell within it. Well, there's a bit of a tension there, isn't there? Where I'm looking at the window here from my office. As I'm looking out outside, is that God's dominion, or according to Psalms itself, according to the tradition, or is that the human domain? Right? Do we own this world? Does God own it? Do we own it temporarily? Do we sort of own it? So let's cut into this. And what I want to make the argument, here's the argument I want to make over the course of the next little while. It's 12, 20, 19, perfect. The argument I want to make is that Jewish tradition does seem to recognize at least some form of ownership, right, by humans of this world. A Jew does own things, but in a mitigated sense. And I want to extend that and explore and extend that mitigation not only to our possessions, and not only even to our land, right? To our movables, but also to our land. I want to extend it beyond our money, to our time, and even to our bodies. Right? And make the claim that Judaism does indeed believe that a Jew owns something, perhaps must own something, yet that is mitigated. And once we explore that mitigation, I want to share with you a teaching from also Tractate Sukkah, a parable, which I found to be very powerful for many years. And I kind of want to gift that over today. And again, make the second claim that adopting or taking seriously the message of that parable could radically affect the way we walk through the world. That's my claim for the next 35 minutes. So bear with me here. Okay, so with that, if you can open the document, that the source sheet, which we're sharing with you, which Ben just put again. And I actually will, at the same time, share a screen here. Give me one moment, please. Here we go. And I'm going to just pull open the source sheet. So this way you can look at it on your own, or you can look at the screen share that I'm pulling up here. 1 second. Yeah, and here's the document. So I want to start with, these are some sources you may be familiar with, maybe they're new to you. Either way works well. Let's start with this Gemara from Tractate Brachot, the laws of blessings, the Tractate of Blessings. This is Brachot 35, the 6th chapter. And as you may know, right, the rabbinic tradition prescribes certain blessings to be recited over before eating or drinking things from the world. For example, Tractate says, "Ketzam mevarchan al perot." How do we bless over various foods? What blessings do we make over fruit? And it says you make the blessing of Borei Pri Ha'etz, make the blessing of the one who created the fruit of the tree, except for wine coming out of grapes, where you say has its own blessing. Okay, so there's a whole Mishnah about that, which I'm scrolling on now. The Mishnah asked, what kind of blessings you make, but it took for granted the fact that we do make blessings to begin with. So the Talmud says, concerning and here I'm reading from the Koran translation, concerning the fundamental basis for blessings, the Gemara asks, from where are these matters? Minahani mili, right? How do we know from the get-go that there is a notion of making blessings, right? A notion of making brachot? What's the fundamental basis for that obligation to recite a blessing before eating? Now, the Talmud here has a whole back and forth and various derivations, but I'm skipping through it all. But at the end of the day, the Talmud says, you know what? the fundamental obligation is svarahi. It is derived from some kind of logic or common sense, right? It's not from a scriptural derivation. It's founded on the following, because on our following reason. One is forbidden to derive benefit from this world without a blessing. Here's it's in the original Hebrew. Asur lo la'adam sheyehanem min ha'olam hazeh below bracha. It is forbidden for a person. It just is understood, taken for granted. It's a kind of like it's not quite logical, but sort of a commonsensical or value-driven rationale, if you will. It's forbidden for a person to derive benefit from this world without making a bracha. And as the sages go on to say, one may not enjoy benefit from the world without bracha. V'chol hana'aneh min ha'olam hazeh below bracha ma'al. And anyone who does so, anyone who derives benefit from this world without a blessing, it is as if that person is guilty of misuse of a consecrated object. That's very interesting, because what that means is that just like it's forbidden, mi'ilah, just as it is forbidden to make use of an object of the temple, right? Sort of a secular use, if you will, a non-sacred use. To take an animal dedicated to the temple, or fruit, money is dedicated to temple, and use it to buy myself a car or anything personal like that. That would be a prohibition. So too, it's forbidden to take anything from this world without first making a blessing. So that frames the entire world as quasi, a bit like a temple, doesn't it? And the Gemara goes on to say, I'm skipping ahead, it brings up a teaching of Rabbi Levi. Rabbi Levi expressed a contradiction. He said, remember those two verses that we all just cited, guys? Right, from Psalm 24 and Psalm 115. So Rabbi Levi says, which one is it? He's raised a contradiction. He says it is written, the earth and all of it contains is the Lord's, Adonai ha'aretz u'maloah, tevel v'yosheva, and it's written elsewhere, the heavens are the Lord's, but the earth is given over to mankind. Which one is it? So there's a contradiction. So here there's a well-known line, which I want to share with you. He said, the Gemara says, La kasha, we can resolve this contradiction. Kan kodem beracha, kan la'achar bracha. This one refers to before there was a blessing, this one after the blessing. Before the blessing, says Rabbi Levi, teaches Rabbi Levi, the earth and all of it contains belongs to God. After the blessing is made, however, the heaven remains God's, the earth has been given over to humankind. Kan kodem bracha, kan achar bracha. So the Talmud is situating bracha, or framing bracha, the phenomenon of blessing, the practice of blessing, as that which transitions things in this world from belonging to God to, and here I'll be careful, to something else. And I think there are two options here, at least two options to how to understand the Talmud here. And it's understanding itself of the function of a bracha, of a blessing. Option A is that even after the bracha is made, it still fundamentally belongs to God, but you now have permission to make use of things in this world. So God is gifting, it's like God's inviting you over to God's house to share of God's stuff. That's one way of reading. I actually suspect, however, that the stronger reading is the more accurate one, which is to say, option B, once one makes a bracha, kan la'achar bracha, once one makes a blessing, the things in this world become owned by the human being. The bracha is some kind of form of what we call a kinyan. It's somehow a form of taking ownership. It affects the taking of ownership. After all, it says that once one makes a bracha, the earth is given over to humankind. So somehow, once, the world is, on the one hand, before the bracha, a sacred temple, if you will. It's God's dominion and God's ownership. But the bracha, the blessing, is what effectuates the transfer of ownership. Now, I'll leave you to think about what the bracha is doing, how it affects that transfer, But it clearly demonstrates, I think, that that ownership is not a natural condition in which we're born into. We have to earn ownership, if you will, by virtue of the blessing. And this is about objects and such. Let me continue on and speak a little bit about land. And I think Larry mentioned Shemitah. So in Leviticus 25, you have one of the most explicit references to the notion that the land itself, or at least here the land, that is to say the land of Israel, belongs to God. This is with regards not to the Shemitah, this every 7th year, the sabbatical year, but the Jubilee year, right? The 50th year. 7 times 7 is 49 plus 1 is the 50th year, during which time all of land sales, at least in theory, are reverted back to their original owners, right? I use that term advisedly. And there the Torah says, Haaretz lo timaker litzmitut, the land shall be not sold in perpetuity, not permanently. Ki li haaretz, because the land is mine, says the speaker, right? Says God. Ki gerim v'toshavim atem imadi, because you are merely as, sort of resident aliens before me. This is not your natural place. This is not yours. Natural, I mean in the sense of it's not fully yours. The land is really mine. And how does that affect itself? How does it reflect itself? Well, one way is indeed via Shemitah, like this year, where there are restrictions on use. The ownership of the landowner is mitigated. We talked earlier about both having monetary possession and control. During Shemitah, one may maintain monetary possession of the land, but they lose some of their control because they can't harvest it. Okay, so there's a mitigation of the ownership during the Shemitah. But in general, even not during the time of the Shemitah, there are certain commandments that are relevant in the land of Israel, at least, which also sort of put a mitigation on one's full ownership and usage, control of one's property. So one example is the mitzvah of Peah, which I want to cite to you, a very interesting Mishnah from the 5th chapter of Peah. Peah is the commandment that one leave over the ends, literally the corners of one's field to the poor. That when you're harvesting, lo techaleh pa'at tzedakah, you may not completely harvest it, completely harvest it. Lo techaleh, don't use all of it, leave some of it over, right? And that's meant to go to the poor. What's the relationship of the poor's ownership to that Peah? This gets also to the question of what's the relationship of, I guess by analogy, we could say the relationship of, the needy to one's possessions. But certainly by Peah, we can talk about the following. So the Mishnah says this really interesting thing, and I bolded it. There's a lot of interesting things here, but in this one line in the middle, it says as follows. I bolded it in the English and the Hebrew, and I underlined, Mi she'eino maniach et ha'aniyim lilkot. O shehu maniach et echad ve'echad lo. O shehu misayet echad mehen. One who does not allow the poor to gather Peah, prevents the poor from coming into their land, his or her land, and doesn't allow them to gather. Or they allow one, but not the other. They privilege one poor person to collect the Peah, but they block access to the other one. Or who helps one of them to gather. They're not preventing someone else from gathering, but they're assisting one in gathering more. So behold, of all those people, listen to this line. Listen to this line. Hareze gozel ataniyim. This person has stolen from the poor. He's a robber of the poor. He is a robber. Hareze gozel. I want you friends to appreciate the power of the rhetoric. Gozel taniyim, because speaking of one who has not given over Peah, we could have said that they have violated a positive commandment. They're cruel, they're stingy. But to say that they're stealing from the poor implies that the poor are the true owners of the Peah. And by not allowing them access to their Peah, to their stalks, to their produce, you're effectively removing it from their pockets. You are robbing them. What a startling formulation. Hareza goes. And imagine living through the world in which you sort of take this notion and extend it out and think of your own possessions and the charity you give, not as giving your charity, but is returning to its rightful owner. That tenth, was it yours and you're giving it? Or has God already demanded that already decided it belongs to the poor? You're allowed to keep the rest of it, but that belongs to the poor. You're merely returning it. So we're talking a bit about produce in the world and monetary possessions. We're talking a little about land here. And I hope you see that, hope you're starting to get a sense of the claim that I made, that there is clearly ownership recognized here, but it's mitigated in a very powerful way. And I want to go on because we've spoken so far about, like I say, produce and objects, movables, and now land. What about our bodies? Do we own our bodies? And I realize there's sort of political ramifications to this. But let's talk about, do we own our bodies? Well, remember that ownership implies control, at least in part. And I want to share with you just a brief line from a Mishnah in Baba Kama. The Mishnah says, "Hachovel ba'atzmo," one who wounds themselves, one who wounds their body. Afa pi she'eino rashai patur. Even though one is not allowed to do so, they're exempt. There's no penalty. There's no sanction. They don't pay anybody. They don't pay themselves. Others who injure you, they owe you damages. Notice that you're not allowed to injure yourself. According to this teaching, one may not injure oneself. Might that imply physically? Might that imply that when it comes to our very bodies, we are not full owners? Even now, there's no penalty if we injure ourselves, but we're not full owners. In some sense, our bodies perhaps belong to God, belong to some other. Our very bodies. By the way, this comes up legally, halachically, with conversations about, can one get a tattoo? Can one pursue elective surgery, cosmetic surgery? Okay, and there's various responses to that, but the question itself, I think, is very important. Right, the notion that our bodies may not fully belong to ourselves. By the way, in terms, the Mishnah continues, "Hakotzeis entiotav afa pi she'eino rashai patur," that one who cuts down their own trees, your own saplings, although it is not permitted for one to do so, they're exempt from any penalty. Notice that again, it goes back to our property. You're not allowed to. Bal tashchit. The Mishnah takes for granted. One cannot just wantonly destroy one's property, one's fruit trees, the things of the world. Now you're exempt, you don't pay yourself or something like that, but you're not allowed to do it. So even our bodies, right, bal tashchit of the world, bal tashchit of our bodies, we not fully belong to ourselves. What about time? We talk about spending time, wasting time. Time is our most valuable commodity and resource. Who owns my time? Giving away your time, donating. Who owns your time? Look, on the one hand, look, we're all volunteering our time, as it were, to be here today, dedicating our time. It's ours to give. We thank Limmud for giving us the platform to be together. Well, look at this amazing teaching. I'm from Bava Metzia. This is page 8 of the source sheet. This amazing teaching, Bava Metzia. The Talmud teaches, I'll just speak in short, I'll tell you the context is talking about workers' rights, essentially. And the sage Rav teaches, Poel yachol lachzor bo afilu b'chetzi hayom. The Talmudic sage Rav teaches that a worker, let's say hired for the day, can retract from the contract even in the middle of the day. They can work in the morning and say, you know what, I quit. Now, why is that? So the Talmud says this is a derivation, right, or a consequence of the verse from Leviticus, Kili b'nei Israel avadim. Because the children of Israel, says God, are my avadim, are my slaves, are my servants. They are mine, who I brought forth from the land of Egypt. And the way the rabbis read that is, Kili b'nei Israel avadim, avadaihim, says God, v'lo avadim la'avadim. They are servants to me, and thus they are not servants to other human beings. Okay? So what that means is that a Jew cannot own, right, another Jew. There are such things as an Eved Ivri, but they're not fully owned. They're not. Right? And a worker is not owned by their employer. The ramification of that is that their time does not fully belong to that owner. Not because it belongs to the worker, but because fundamentally the worker's time itself belongs to God. So it's interesting, by the way, it's an interesting sort of move by talking about by virtue of being in servitude to another, to God, you are more free vis-a-vis human beings. Which means that, right, a Jew can't be enslaved to another Jew with a contract from which he cannot release himself whenever he wishes. He can release himself. I want to share with you that there are those in medieval Ashkenaz who ruled, and this comes down in the codes, that it was forbidden for, unless except under exigent circumstances, it's fundamentally forbidden for a Jew to sign a long-term contract, to sign away their time for more than 3 years. Okay, how one does this actually, how it plays out in reality is more complicated. But the fundamental notion is that one cannot sort of sign a long-term contract and sign away their freedom of time, right, for more than 3 years. Why? Because you're a servant of God. Because your time is not fully your own to give. Even your time. Now we know this from Shabbat, of course, and holidays, right? That's sacred time. So the tradition sort of assumes that, not all of not 24/7 doesn't all belong to you, but even the time that you thought does belongs to you only sort of, in a limited manner, in a mitigated sense. It's yours, but you can't sign away your freedom because your freedom belongs to God. So thus far, what I've tried to do, I'm going to stop screen sharing for a second so I can see you all at once. But thus far, what I've tried to claim or tried to show through these various sources is that, look, the tradition, I think, does take for granted that we own. That we have ownership, that there's such a thing as a person having monetary claims over something, having rights, relationships, privileges, and responsibility vis-a-vis their own property, their own land, their own bodies, their own time. And yet it's always mitigated. And peeking through here and there, it's explicit. But every once in a while, you come across this teaching, a law, a verse, other times a story, a parable, we'll get to that, which indicates that ownership is mitigated. It's not full. There's a sense in which one owns, but maybe lowercase o, or only in some sense, even about your time, even about your and our bodies. And to walk, and all the more so, one's possessions and money. So one walks through the world with, thus far, these teachings, with an understanding of, yes, I own, but not fully, not all the way. Think about payah, not to the end of the field. Let me pause for a moment for any reactions or questions or comments. Feel free to unmute. Yeah, Phyllis.
So when you talked about the earth, after the blessing was said, the earth belongs to people, I guess. So, that's communal ownership, I imagine. So how do we deal with the question of countries and taking care of the earth? It's not an individual ownership, it's communal. So is it okay to have nation states? Is it okay to, just cut down the rainforest? How do you deal with those questions?
Right. So you touch on a couple of different points, and I'll just say briefly in response to like your very big, appropriately big question is, yes, I mean, I guess Psalms does sound like ha'aretz natan l'bnei adam, to all of humanity. But think about, already in Genesis and certainly in Deuteronomy, the book of Joshua, the sense of the land itself being divided among the tribes, right, among different nations in the beginning of Genesis chapter 10 and 11, right, after the flood. The nation spreading over and taking out different spaces. So I think there is a sense of private ownership, of tribal ownership, of communal ownership. So it can be subdivided, but it is a good point actually to think about, maybe all of that is already a second level. It's like first belongs to all of humanity. Assuming it belongs to humanity, it belongs to all of humanity, and then it's sort of subdivided. That's interesting. That's a very interesting point. We've got your second point about stewardship and such. So I'll remind us that even that which we do own, we still have the prohibition of bal tashchit. We still have the prohibition of destroying, which again implies that we don't have full control, and therefore it's a mitigated ownership. So there is that prohibition. In addition to the general call to, at least in the Garden of Eden, but maybe that's a metaphor for everything, l'avdal l'shamra, to work it and to protect it, to be stewards in this world, and not to destroy. So I think that your question is very much on point. Thank you. Anybody else? Questions or thoughts or anything? Okay, feel free to jump back in, but I want to sort of bring us to a close in this short session with the final discussion, final source, and this is I said I wanted to share with you a very important parable. So that goes as follows, and I'm going to share the screen again. And we're going back now to the third chapter of Sukkah, their relevant tractate, right? It's about leaving your home, which you own, and going into a temporary dwelling, vulnerable to circumstance and such, and shaking the four species which one must own. Now the Mishnah there teaches, the rabbis teach, and here I'm not reading yet, I'm just talking at this point outside. The rabbis teach that a stolen lulav, if one steals a lulav, one of the palm branch from the four species from somebody else, if one steals a lulav from somebody and tries to fulfill the mitzvah of shaking the four species with that lulav, it doesn't work. Right? That lulav is disqualified. Doesn't work. And the opening discussion there, sugya there, explores why that is. Not yours. And it is what the rabbis call, I'm excising pieces from a very interesting sugya. I recommend the page itself. It says, Mishum dahavale mitzvah ba'a ba'avera. It is unfit because, I'm here on the bottom of page 8, because it is a mitzvah that comes to be fulfilled by means of a transgression. And that means you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah. You can't fulfill the mitzvah by doing an avera. Mitzvah haba'a ba'avera. You can't fulfill the commandment of shaking the lulav, the four species, by stealing it. As it is stated in the quote, a verse from the prophet Malachi, and you have brought, the prophet's yelling at the people, he says, look what you brought to the temple. You brought that which is stolen, and the lame, and the sick. That's how you bring the offering? Should I accept this as God? Of course not. And notice how the verse juxtaposes the lame and the sick with the stolen. They're all disqualified. Teaches this verse and teaches this passage. And by the way, I'll note that why are they all disqualified? This goes back to something, I think maybe it's Larry, I forget who mentioned this in a chat a while back. Why is it that a lame or sick animal is disqualified for sacrifice? Could be a bunch of reasons. It's not appropriate, it's not aesthetically pleasing, it's dishonorable. But also, if you think about fundamentally the sacrificial act as one of, which has to sort of cause you loss, right? It has to cost you something. Mm-hmm. Think about when you want to gift to somebody, right? You want to sacrifice for something. It doesn't cost you anything, it's not a sacrifice. Okay. Well, if something is lame or sick, if your animal is lame or sick already, to give that over, it's not going to do much for you anyway monetarily. If you're a shepherd, Okay, you already can't really use it. So you might as well offload it. It's like, donate to charity your broken down car. It's like, wow, what a tzaddik you are. Great. What does that do for the world? Okay, who's that helping? You already couldn't use it. Didn't cost you a thing. The stolen the same way. Maybe that's what Malach is teaching, saying the stolen wasn't yours. Didn't cost you anything. So you steal from somebody else, cost them, didn't cost you, and that's what you sacrifice? That's not the sacrifice I'm looking for in the world. You really want to sacrifice in this world, it has to be yours to begin with. And with that, I want you to just explore with me the following text. It's an amazing parable. Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, what is the meaning of the verse from Isaiah? For I, the Lord, love justice. I hate robbery in a burnt offering. Ani Hashem, ohev mishpat, loving justice, sone gezel ba'olah. What does that mean? I hate theft when it comes to the sacrifice, to the burnt offering. Now, the fact that he's asking the question, what does it mean, means that there's something about this verse which puzzles him. We'll find out what puzzles him by virtue of his answer. So hold on a moment. We'll go backwards. We'll reverse engineer this. He says, let me teach you a parable. Mashal, lamelech basar v'adam. The rabbis love to do this. You have a parable, take an example flowing from the human realm to try to understand the divine realm. Mashal lamelech basar v'adam. A parable of a human king. Shahaya over al beit hameches, who was passing by a customs house, a toll booth. He says to his servants, Amar lavadav, pay the toll. The king says, Tenu mechas lamuchsin, pay the toll. Amru lo, the servants say to him, why are we paying the toll? Halo kol hamechas kula shelchahu. Doesn't all the tax belong to you anyway? You're paying yourself. If the taxes will ultimately reach the royal treasury, why are you, the monarch, paying the toll? Amar lahem. So the king says to his servants, my servants, you don't understand. Mimeni yilmedu kol ovrei derachim v'lo yavrichu atzman min hameches. He says, no, you don't understand. From my conduct, from me, all the other travelers will learn and will pay the tax. Or actually, as he says, it will not evade paying the tax. King says, I'm trying to be a good role model, trying to show them that I pay, even I pay. If I pay the tax, you all should pay the tax. You're going to say to me, what's the point of you paying the tax? It goes to you anyway. You're taking out of one pocket, but put another pocket. Mimeni yilmedu. Let them learn from me. This is the king qua teacher, qua royal pedagogue. And says the teaching, says the parable, Af HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so to the Holy Blessed One, so to God says, Ani Hashem, Sone Gezel Be'olah. I am God and I hate stolen sacrifices. Mimeni yilmedu banai, let my children learn from me. V'yavrichu atzman min hagezel, and distance themselves from robbery, from theft. Let them learn from me. What a parable. What did the rabbis think was difficult about this verse from Isaiah? What question are they answering by means of this parable? I'm asking you. Larry, what do you think?
If God owns the animal anyway, then the person bringing the sacrifice is just kind of a middleman. That's God sacrificing to himself.
Precisely, right?
Yeah.
Why would God hate robbery in a burnt offering? By the way, the burnt offering, as someone pointed out, it's the offering that goes completely up to God, right? It's not the kind that's like, partly goes up to God and partly gets eaten by the priest and such, right? So the whole thing goes up to God. So why would God, why would God care about robbery, about a stolen object? oh, it doesn't belong to you, the sacrifice, it belonged to God anyway. That's the presumption of the interpreter. It's a claim. Actually, Rashi says this explicitly. Rashi says there, so ne gezel ba'olah, I despise the stolen sacrifices you bring me, afa pisha kol sheli, even though it's all mine. Ba'af mitchila sheli hayta, and was mine from the get-go. Was mine from the beginning. So that's the question he's trying to understand. Why should God care if it's stolen? But that question, which Larry articulated, actually begs a deeper or a more fundamental question and paradox of sacrifice, which is, how could one sacrifice to God if it belonged to God to begin with? And how could we demand that you can only sacrifice that which you own if you, by definition, can't fully own it? What is going on in this world? And here I'm going to stop the screen share so I can see you. And we're going to sort of wrap up in a couple of minutes here. Well, there's different ways of understanding this mashal and what claims it might be making about sacrifice and about the world. But what it does to say explicitly is that just as God respects ownership, right, respects other people's possessions and rights, right, God wants us to follow suit, perhaps by not purchasing stolen goods, in direct analogy to the sacrifices, right? Not, which limits the gains and motivation to bootleg and such, but more broadly by not stealing, and even more broadly by respecting this notion of ownership, especially of others. The disqualification, according to this text, of stolen object, therefore, is not fundamentally due to like a legal technicality of ownership. Well, you don't really own it, so you can't really sacrifice it. It's rather an educational, virtual, cultivating effort by God and by the tradition to reinforce the problematics of stealing and to reinforce the respect of other people's ownership. That's like a local, effect of this mashal. But I want to end with a broader point or a question, which is, what would it mean to take this mashal super seriously, this parable really seriously? What would it mean today, during the Shemitah year, more broadly, to really take, to live with the consciousness of this parable? And what you'd have to do is adopt kind of like a two-tiered consciousness. On one level of consciousness, you'd have to walk through the world believing that everything belongs to God. Kula shalihi, afmi tchila shalihi. It's mine, says God. The world is mine, land is mine. The animal was mine to begin with. Your money is mine. Your land is mine. This land is your land. This land is my land. This land is mine. Maybe your time is mine. Your bodies are mine. And yet, here's tier two. At the same time, you have to have like a sophisticated consciousness. At the same time, we have to live as if we own. You live as if you own, and as if others own. You have to embrace that full bundle of sticks. I mean, it's mitigated by the commandments of charity and whatnot, but embrace that full bundle of sticks, the relationships, the rights, the privileges, and the responsibilities of ownership, with its concrete limitations and mitigations, and yet with, nonetheless, the consciousness that fundamentally it's all as if. It's all as if I own my possessions. I do own it, but it's as if I own my land, as if I own my time, as if I own my body. And my claim to you, or my challenge to us, I guess I should say, because I teach this as much to others as to myself to reinforce it, is the challenge is, can we walk through the world with responsibility and sense of possession and such, and ownership and respect, acting with agency in this world, as if we own, yet knowing that in some sense, it's all as if. Some fundamental bit belongs to God. So I'll leave you with that kind of challenge, and that challenge, and that to take this text really seriously, and to think about what would it mean to walk through the world with that consciousness. To some extent, there's like concrete consequences, charity, leaving over, not destroying. There's also it's an issue of how you see yourself and how you walk through this world in terms of your posture and orientation. And I think that's something very, very important to think about during a Shemitah year, Larry, but also in general. So thanks. It's a pleasure to meet you all from all over the place, which is very cool. And my email is on the source sheet, and I'm always happy to chat.